So we start now our last round of lectures and roundtables from the festival. Actually, we are approaching the end of this opening week, unfortunately. And here with me today we have the winners of our Open Call 2024, Ano Zibelnik and Jakob Ganslmeier. Thank you so much for being here and accepting the invitation to do this talk. To moderate the talk, we have Christina Töpfer from Camere Austria, which I thought would be very much appropriate and the best person to guide this talk tonight. Christina, thank you also to you for accepting the invitation, and I will give you the word. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fernanda, for this very nice introduction and also for the invitation to the festival and for having us here. It's a real pleasure to see the festival and to see the works in the spaces because I saw many of them in the portfolios, and yeah, it's great to be here in person, I think. Yeah, and I would say we dived immediately into it. I guess many of you have seen the exhibition by Anna and Jakob, Fault Line, which is shown here. And sorry, it's too not loud enough, sorry. And in general, the practice of Jakob Ganslmeier and Ano Zibelnik tackles societal issues such as climate anxiety, online trends, and the influence of extreme ideologies on youth culture. And yeah, we will discuss two works actually tonight. So you're going to start with Bereitschaft, which was not shown here, but which was produced for an exhibition at the Photography Museum in Amsterdam at Foam this year. And then we will continue to discuss Fault Line, which we have all seen, I guess. And yes, we agreed upon that we will do a small interchange, also not just a presentation, but it's quite an open format. And before we dive into the contents, introduce the artists whom you've already met over the last few days, but just very briefly. Ano Zibelnik was born in Ljubljana and is a visual artist and photographer with a master's degree in film and photographic studies from University of Leiden. And Jakob Ganslmeier was born in Munich and graduated with a master's degree in photography and society at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Den Haag in the Netherlands, where they also both live. And since 2022, they formed a duo and are working together. Their common work dives into topics like ecological crisis, climate fear, and the social implications of them, but also the visual representation of radical ideologies and which opposing narratives might be developed from there. And I guess that's also a good starting point to enter into Bereitschaft directly, I guess. And yeah, I hand the word over to you.
Thank you, Fernanda and Christina, for this introduction. Is it not turned on? No, it's on. So thank you for this introduction, Christina and Fernanda. As you already said, we decided to switch the presentation around and start with a work that we're not showing here, but is kind of important. It represents an important part of our artistic practice. This is the video Bereitschaft, which we developed for an exhibition that opened this year at Foam Museum in Amsterdam. And I will keep it very short because we want to show you a 5-minute piece of this work. It's basically a story about a fascist statue with this same title, Bereitschaft, or readiness in English, which became an obsession on TikTok. So I would suggest that we continue with the
Do you hear me now better? Ah, yeah, good.
But I think they could.
Okay. Otherwise, we have this Forrest Gump moment when he stands in front of Washington. But anyway, like when we found on TikTok many young teenagers, especially young men, who wanted to have the same facial features as this Ano Zibelnik statue. That was a moment where we thought, like, hey, what is happening right now? Like, because they were always like with this, basically, it starts very, let's say, with Ano Zibelnik workouts, but it goes until hunter eyes, until basically real facial features, which the ideal picture of Ano Zibelnik, which left an uncanny picture.
Handing over to me. No, maybe it's also interesting, you know, because fitness is something that we never perceived as something bad. We also don't want to give this statement. I also want to make sure that it's understood that we don't talk against social media, but we do follow this kind of strange developments on them, like online rabbit holes. I wanted to say that, yeah, we're always interested in looking at the very mainstream phenomena, which beauty and fitness trends are, and look how they actually overlap with far-right ideologies. And somehow this was such a case, because what Jakob is showing right now are examples which are clearly, well, they have a clearly ideological content on them, but sometimes you would also find boys who were clearly not aware of the origin of this statue reposting it and actually comparing their facial features and bodies to it. And that's actually where it gets really interesting for us, because very often the extreme right ideologies are spread by people who don't know what they're sharing by this ambiguity surrounding them. But maybe we can... Yeah, there's quite a lot of interesting quotes in this work. Maybe you caught that one. I mean, this refers pretty much to the title, readiness, like in this strange wish of, you know, identity formation to belong to some movement. And at least we understand fitness like, you know, young men in their teenage years, they find in influencers like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and many others this simple instructions for life. You just follow these rules and it will be fine. I mean, Andrew Tate even himself says in this video, I just want a simple framework to adhere to. I want to be a good person and I want something very clear. So, you know, this is kind of ideas that we were exploring in this work. And yeah, the extreme discipline, like this militaristic discipline, the going to the gym every morning, waking up early, taking a cold shower, like putting yourself in difficult physical situations. This is something very fascinating, because you also find these guys, like influencers online, talking about something which they call the bitch voice, which supposedly symbolizes the feminine energy, which is something weak, or that's what they say or suggest with this expression. So yeah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe Christina wants to. I don't know. But basically what you have seen, the excerpt of the video was three stacked screens on top of each other. We also rebuilt in the installation the gym as an ideological space. As Anna already said, working out is great and the things go up. Like, it's very healthy. The Dutch are great at it. But where it becomes really interesting, as Anna said, is when it becomes when you're not working out only for, you know, feeling better, when you're working out basically to look like Ano Zibelnik, to look like a fascist statue, if you're working out to have to become the defender of your family, to become part of a world where women are just an add-on and you're just hanging out with your bros. And in these circumstances, we were always moving. Where does it become actually a fascist tendency, and where is it actually totally, let's say, just a teenage, let's say, thing, but they just want to belong to something?
Sorry. What I was thinking about when you just spoke about those fitness trends is also the fact, like, of course, there's this discipline and this really, like, ambitious structure of the everyday life, but actually with the quote that we just saw, it is also conveyed that there's like a really strange and very frightening dissociation from any historical consciousness. So like, if like this readiness to fight, and also this will to fight, or the idea even of fighting in a battle like the Battle of Hastings or so. It, like, personally, I get reminded of those images we've seen from the storm on the Capitol and things like that, where really like a reenactment of historical events that were not to be glorified, I guess, and becomes totally normalized and also appropriated in a very strange way from people who obviously don't have any idea about the historical context. I think that's also something I find super interesting in your work, which is being conveyed in these very contemporary images from social media, but from people who probably don't have any awareness of where these contexts come from.
Absolutely. Maybe a few sentences how we work, because like when we started, we do have huge archives, and we're real collectors. So it's a bit like, we're gold digging basically for evil things. But in previous works, we were always going for very, very the extremists of the extremists of the extremists, like really going into, hardcore neo-Nazi computer games, going into very, very dark corners of the internet. The fitness trends are something where we turned us very much around. We wanted really something which is mainstream, which is not like, which is where you don't have to 3 times explain this is because of that and that and that, something that we all know. The fitness cults we do know, and they're per se, as Anna said, definitely not bad. But we then basically built folder structures where we download terabytes of things, like this is just already like, let's say, the 5th stage or something, and then basically built folder structures which are making sense in a way, like because we also have a lot of men, for example, are part of raw meat eaters. There are whole trends around raw meat. We didn't include that because that really got a bit disgusting. But maybe you say something about the narrative.
No, I mean, as you have seen, the video is not really edited in a classical sense, so we didn't have this artistic control that you would normally have of, deciding on the order of images and how exactly they will behave. But we were lucky to collaborate on this with a Dutch, how are they called it, Studio Render, RNDR, from Den Haag. They're basically a motion design studio, and they helped us through the software that they developed to come up with a visual strategy for how to treat this online content. And we, before we went into editing it visually, we took our archives and looked through the content and decided on certain parameters that we wanted to be reflected in the work. And this was directly taken from TikTok. So one of the things that is really characteristic for this fitness trends is the idea of de-individualization and multiplication. So how this body as an armor becomes part of the army eventually, and they become soldiers. So this is why we had this, constant images multiplying and going back to one image and becoming the statue. And this meant that, as I said, we had not really much control. We had to be very precise in basically, instead of going to Premiere Pro or another software and slicing the content up into an order, we had to write like minutes 2.1, an image of a statue comes up and multiplies over 3 screens. On top we see this one, on the bottom we see this one. So it was a little bit more challenging than usually, but it's also really nice to be surprised in this sense. It was the first time for us working with a different technology, let's say.
And how we made it was basically like we first extracted the voice, built the narrative, and then gave the pictures to it. And I think that is already then. I mean, that is then already. I think you, right?
That's my part, yeah. It's your work, but it's my part. No, so we also decided to give a little bit of a background on our previous project, because we have been working as a duo for 4 years, like Christina said in the introduction, but very often when, Faultline and Bereitschaft are 2 very different projects, and when people see it, they tend to assume that this ideological part of our work has more to do with Jakob and his background, whereas the other is more mine. But this is really not the case, so we wanted to give some background. And for example, the series Hautstein by Jakob dealt with former neo-Nazis who were exiting the scene, which is a very difficult process, and they actually get, it's not always only that you have to want it, you also get life threats when you try to do that. So it's a difficult process, and he was photographing them in the process of removal of their tattoos, of their ideological tattoos, which are used as a sign of commitment to the ideology. And these images were then contrasted in the work with images of German context or symbols that still appear in architecture and on buildings all over the country. And basically the series is asking the question of how well has the German past really been dealt with.
Again there, because in this work, but also in what you mentioned, you have been following like Nazi video games, and also in other works you have been doing separately or together. You had an interest in memorial culture and also in the reinterpretation of history. And so I see it as a very ongoing line in your practice. And I was just wondering, where does it come from, this interest? So how was it raised, or how did you enter in these scenes also? Because it's a very specific interest, and at the same time it's not so easy also to get into this. And maybe the second part of the question, how did you end up in the internet from there?
Well, like the Dutch always love when I say like I grew up in Dachau, and like that is why I'm dealing with the German past. But in fact, like many people live in Dachau and they don't deal with these things on a regular basis. Luckily, maybe for them, healthy for them. But when I was studying, the NSU happened, and the NSU was the National Socialist Underground, which was a terror group which killed over 10 people in Germany, and the German police was always thinking like this are Turkish mafia killings and murders, and figured like after hell of a time and many mismanagement and very evil things. Figured that these are actually free neo-Nazis who are traveling through the country and killing people. And that was basically the moment where many people like me started to think again, like how past is that, and I had a teacher, his name was Ludwig Rauch. He photographed the neo-Nazi scene in the beginning of the 90s. In East Berlin, and I wrote a text about his work, and that deepened my interest very much, because it was a text about the people that he photographed, what kind of role did they play in the NSU, and why after 1990 or before 1990, why was the GDR in East Berlin such a good breeding ground for neo-Nazis in a presumably anti-fascist state. But the internet was something that we really developed together, because Anna was already part or saw this work, and the internet practice was something that we fully dove in together, because there it became very interesting, and Anna will say something probably about our collaboration now.
We first got to work together, or as I will start differently. After my graduation in Leiden, I landed the job at Paradox, which is a Dutch production organization. And this job was an international, to be the project manager of an international initiative of memorial centers. So I had no previous overlap or interest in this topic, besides like any person has. But it kind of started there for me. So this was in 2019 or early 20. And the idea was to explore the notion of the so-called perpetrator perspectives, because in the memorial culture or the kind of discourse of memorials, it's always more victim focused, so which is normal and right, but there's also, the perpetrators are easily mystified, and in Hollywood they have been portrayed so in such a cheesy way that it's very easy to distance yourself from it. And what they wanted to do with this project is to open up a kind of deeper understanding of this position, and especially the representation of perpetrators historically. So Jakob was a commissioned artist on this project while I was managing it, and over 3-4 years almost that it took, it happened very unprofessionally of me that I jumped over to the artistic team and we started working on it together. And this is how we also got into the online part, which was the question, because the memorials have the tendency to historicize, obviously, so they kind of wanted us to do a historical work, but we were really trying to open up the discourse to the online, because we always thought you can't deal with the past if you don't follow how fastly it's actually developing on the internet and what a danger this actually presents to spreading of the ideologies. And in the first year we had quite some difficulties to explain ourselves why we think this is so important, because especially an older generation, they just wouldn't take it seriously. So they always told us, this is memes, I don't understand what it means, this is not my thing, like I'm not on social media, I don't want to hear about it, do some memorial art. Essentially, that was the conclusion. But by the time we finished, we actually only dealt with online culture. So I guess we succeeded in that sense.
This is the Gigapedia, which was in the foam show next to, in front of the exhibition, basically a huge print who explains the symbols that we've worked with in the video works. And here it was really like about giving a better understanding to the viewer what kind of symbols are out there, how do they merge, where do they come from, and like to basically read this online language, because very often many people actually who normally like consume many videos, very often you don't recognize this one picture or this one joke or this one meme because it just goes under in the mass of the image streams that we all consume every day. But when you pay attention to it, when you start to understand the vocabulary of this secret language, which is so powerful because it is secret, like it is a little bit like when two little school kids are talking with each other in a secret language, it immediately makes everybody else jealous. What are they talking about? And that gives power, which is quite unneeded. That's why we built basically this glossaries of symbols.
I would want to know how your research worked, because as we have seen, like these are really comprehensive projects somehow. Like you have two researches that are going on, like one on the visual level with the image folders that you're obviously obsessively collecting and also have to scan, like you have to scan the internet all the time, obviously. And then there's this content-based research, as we have just seen in the glossary. And I would be interested in how you approach this. Are you also working with other people there? Or how can you handle all this information also, which is actually also changing all the time because the internet happens so quickly, right? Like there's always something popping up and disappearing or being altered. How does it work?
No, this is true. I mean, I would say we're seasonal workers in relation to the two projects being different types of research. So in the summer or in spring, we always work on fault line, and then the long winter comes and we are closed in the studio and dive into TikTok for several hours a day. Okay. So first, I would say we really research in a kind of immersive way, not a healthy way. I don't recommend it, but by spending a lot of time on TikTok through personal accounts. So we don't kind of scrap the internet and gather a lot of content at once, but we really want this experience of being pulled in, and also through your personal biases and preferences maybe, because this whole recommendation algorithm, right, it's supposed to know you better than you know yourself. So it's frightening what kind of stuff ends up on your feed by just a little bit or very briefly engaging with some extremist content. But yeah, essentially we just go deeper and deeper and deeper and collect all this stuff and organize it in the folders that we were showing earlier. And then since now it's okay. Like now we're showing this visual compass here. Maybe can say a little bit about that. Because next to the exhibition at Foam, we also we wanted to mediate it a little bit. So the Gigapedia was shown before the exhibition entrance. We wanted everyone to kind of have this crash course of visual literacy before entering, because not everybody is young and on social media. And actually, exactly this generational gap is something that we're always trying to address in the work, because it definitely contributes to polarization. And this is how we ended up doing these workshops next to it, which use the research material that we gather.
Which is actually quite interesting, because even if you're on social media, it doesn't mean that you are receiving these contents or that you can read them, because to decipher these images or also their cultural historical relations, I guess it's not so easy, right? And I wanted to ask about the visual literacy workshops also, because I saw on your homepage that they are also very diverse, so they are directed at different audiences, and maybe it would be interesting to speak about how you conceive them and what is being discussed there, and also how do the people who attend them react on them, or what do they take out of these workshops? Because I think the more, also for me in the preparation of this talk, I realized like I know some things. I mean, I'm better in photography, but I know some things about the internet. But as soon as you dive into it deeper, you are completely lost, and also like you're also lost in vocabulary in some way. That's the feeling that I had when dealing with your work, also in more detail. And so I guess it's quite interesting what people learn in your workshops, or the insights that also you receive when you are doing them.
Yeah, I mean, lots. Our media literacy workshops are mostly building up on. We built up with political graphs, which goes from normie to red-pilled, and from violence to humor, and basically from being so-called the normie to being totally ideologized in a right extremist way, to violence, to humor. And the interesting thing is, of course, like different generations evaluate it differently. Like we do use these workshops also for our own research. And it is like the exhibition title Giga comes from basically always trying to top each other, which is a very, very online, let's say, reflex. Because only when you only when you go to the extreme, you have the views. Only when you basically top each other, you get you get basically the attention that you are seeking for. Which means like that in the end product, the people who are, for example, defending animal rights to people who are defending gun rights all end up with Auschwitz visuals, because that is basically that's basically when the most evil, or the like the really the top of the most horrible. And but the interesting thing about these workshops is actually not that you place something in the most red-pilled, violent corner. Of course that happens. The more interesting is actually the middle, because extremism has a problem in its word, that it suggests that it comes from the extreme part of society, while it is actually born in the middle. And these middle images are the ones that we are basically always balancing or navigating our works from.
I guess that's also the point where like this illiteracy in the end comes in, right? Because like also images that have a certain context, they move to the middle and get viral there, but without people who receive them and who share them again being able to really decipher the content. I guess that's maybe associated with this, right?
Absolutely.
Especially after the pandemic, because maybe in the past the neo-Nazi propaganda channels were more secret, maybe on Telegram they were not so easily accessible, but nowadays they're very much aware that they have to infiltrate the mainstream in order to be successful, and they very much also depend on people, as I said earlier, who are not completely aware of what they're sharing. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add, I guess.
Yeah, maybe this exchange that you're pursuing in the visual literacy workshops is also not so far away even from Fortline, or like both projects. That's maybe also the connection, which is not so visible at first sight, what we just said at the beginning, that both projects probably deal with the individual within a community, while it's maybe in Bereitschaft more like the search for a community, or like the wish to identify with a group of people and a group of, like a cohort where you associate yourself with. In Fortline, you're actually following individuals who are part of the climate movement and or who are affected by climate change. And I was thinking before about the title also, which is because the fold is the crack on the Earth's surface, but the fault line is actually the line of cracks. So you're actually also following a line of climate disasters across southern Europe and the Mediterranean in a way, right?
Yeah, we were interested actually not so much in a line of climate disasters, although this is true that we follow them, but especially in the, let's say, what are going to be the societal breaking points. That's why the title. And we thought like climate anxiety and climate activism were one of the first phenomena that we tackled. It's definitely not the only ones. We're also dealing, of course, with migration and hateful ideologies, but it was the starting point because this psychological impact of the climate crisis we felt when we started at least was not really a topic. It wasn't perceived that maybe something that only privileged kids experience. You know, people say that actually. But maybe to explain it, if in case somebody is not aware, climate anxiety or eco-anxiety is basically a fear which can take over a young person's life, or not necessarily young, but it can be quite consuming. So we met people who, you know, we also worked with a psychologist who told us that people commit suicide because of fear of the climate change. And a lot of these activists, for them being part of the movements is very identity giving, so they really commit to it with all their personality, with all their life. Sometimes they would also quit education or stop making plans about their futures because they feel there is no purpose beyond activism, because nothing is really worth it. So this was the very starting point.
And after basically photographing and starting to portray young climate activists we started with Fridays for Future and Greenpeace. At the same time, in our first trip a year ago in May, the floods happened in Emilia-Romagna. And the interesting thing was immediately how these floods were used by politicians. Like, it immediately had a very polarizing effect. Meloni flew back from Japan, took a picture with a shovel, and she was good off, but told everybody that it is actually it is bad weather, and if it's climate change, then the Green Party is responsible. And the climate activists were coming and were basically had also very different reactions to it. The Fridays for Future activists were trying to clean every house that they could, you know, helping everybody. Last Generation, in comparison to that, were collecting the mud from Emilia-Romagna, drove it to Rome, invited all media channels, and poured the mud over their head to basically get attention about the climate crisis. And immediately in Italy, like, being in a climate movement means being against Meloni, being against like any kind of nationalism, and that was very inspiring. Like, that was also something that we, that was the collectiveness was incredible.
No, it was also maybe interesting because you mentioned these different movements to see these different approaches and how some of them are in a way more political, or, you know, Fridays for Futures were always they had their tactics. They would write letters to their mayors, and they would go to the European Parliament and speak to the politicians, whereas the Last Generation is always about creating the image. And they actually have also different approaches in different countries. Like, as you may know, in Germany, they're always gluing themselves to the ground, or in some countries, they're gluing themselves to artworks. But in Italy, we had the impression that they don't compete for attention. They seemed much more complementary in a way. Or whenever we tried to poke with questions a little bit, do you approve of each other's tactics? They would say, well, not necessarily, or I wouldn't do it personally, but I see the value of doing it both ways because it's way too urgent not to get attention. If you have to pour mud over your head, then this is what you have to do. Here it gets more interesting.
No, like in the scope of this project, like in the after the first trip of these horrible floods where we stood until the water until here, and people were you were asking them like you saw people on the first floor and they said like, yeah, what are you doing? And we said like, yeah, we are photographing the effects of these floods and climate crisis and so on. And they immediately always believed the story of yeah, like the bad weather or climate crisis is not real, or like the conspiracy theories were flourishing. And one thing which was one like on our second trip doing a massive heat wave, we photographed a lot of climate deniers, and these climate deniers do have a lot of power because they have like prominent positions. Like they do have their scientific, let's say, alternative facts. And for example, here he is explaining the little ice age, and this is where we are today, and we have been there already before, and they do basically make up their own facts, which makes it not very pleasant to talk to, but very interesting when you think, okay, like the non-belief in the climate crisis or in climate change does come from somewhere, which is very rooted in these voices.
Yeah, this is another portrait of a climate activist, but maybe we can jump to and you didn't have to hand it off.
No, like now it's my turn to introduce Anna's work and previous work, which is called Immortality is Commonplace, in which Anna already talked with a lot of young people about climate anxiety, and were basically always looking for the connection where basically how photography positions itself to the climate crisis and what role does it play and how does it actually develop from that. And already here, like a lot of material about climate anxiety she brought to the table, and basically we went with that knowledge also, like which helped a lot to Italy. Was that all right?
That was all right. Thank you. Okay, but I wanted to continue there. Yeah, this is then, as you said, we returned in the summer, and it was quite surreal because in May in Emilia-Romagna, which is such a flat landscape, this water was standing there for 15 days. Some places even longer, and it was really starting to rot when we returned to see how the situation has evolved. So you would see this 30-50 centimeters of mud, which was completely rotten underneath, but it looked like desert on top. And I think it's actually quite toxic to continue farming on such land, but I think they will never make an investigation about the soil quality. Yeah, and this was another coincidence. We were visiting our friends for a little break on our work trip, and then this sort of tornado came while we were having lunch where he lived, in a little village, also in Emilia-Romagna. But I wanted to go to Greece. Yeah, this is why I took the microphone, because we're always interested in the second-hand consequences of extreme weather events. So last year in August, Greece had what they said were the biggest wildfires ever in Europe. And why we were attracted to this situation was not because they were the biggest or the worst, but because we saw so many conspiracy theories popping up online. And we saw locals filming themselves how they're basically chasing migrants with vans and trying to put all the blame on them. So the narrative was, there were different explanations, but one of the narratives was that the migrants are setting the fire because they want to see the way to Europe better, because these fires took place on the Greek-Turkish border. And it's a horrible conspiracy. Nobody understands how you could come up with such an idea, but we're always interested in how this actually comes up, what kind of level of fear is actually necessary and what kind of loneliness these people are starting from, because it's easy to judge, but when you see how left alone they are, how the government is not in touch for months sometimes, they let them wait in, whole families living in a single room without any kind of information, then it becomes kind of clearer how somebody could come up with such a theory.
Which is maybe also not so far away from the internet-based works you're doing, like the conspiracy theories that are being shared there, right?
No, it's very close. Because as you can imagine, like when you are, people are not necessarily very rich there, and these people like lost their whole home, which they saved for, and where they basically also had so many memories with, and then basically somebody from the government comes and puts a yellow or red cross on your house, which means you get either 5,000 or 10,000 euros, maybe someday, and that is obviously a very desperate moment. And many of these people actually, like they going there was very helpful because you really understand the breeding ground for these conspiracy theories. That's why we were also so happy that we were there. Somebody who was not from there, like actually was caring about their situation, was very welcoming and taking pictures of them, because all their photo albums just burned. So like they got basically like a moment, and that like is always like a very difficult moment, because you can only highly disagree with the thing that somebody says, like, yeah, refugees want to see the way, and that's why they're responsible for these fires. On one hand, on the other hand, like it is like also an unimaginable situation that they have been in. So like these grey moments in these pictures were always something that we were looking for, without going for the apocalyptic doom picture. Like I think the moment again why it pulls you in is certainly an analogy to Bereitschaft before.
I mean, I read the text in the exhibition before, and I found it, quite touching also how you approach the people who were affected by those catastrophes, and how they also get a voice in the text, like they're a mixture of your own diary entries and of the conversations you had with them, and it always becomes quite obvious and very, close somehow also how precarious the situation that you entered into was also. And what I also find interesting about the practice, like also on the visual and textual level, is how you take these very documentary, very clearly documentary images, obviously, and you have those texts that are based on like real experiences, and at the same time you bring them together in a way which is not like a linear narrative, right? But you just pick out different aspects of climate change and climate crisis and of those narratives, and they all are being assembled together to a bigger picture or to some parts of a picture. And to me, this is a very strong point of the project, I think, but I'm also wondering, why did you choose to do so? Why don't you associate the text with the people? What made you do that?
I think you're right in saying that they're documentary images because we don't stage them, but they're not documentary in a sense of, we photograph a person and then we want to add a caption and say, oh, this is this guy's story. We try to create also with a visual strategy, which is more like creating a disturbing feeling of the situations, not so much depicting necessarily the extent of the damage or the how infrastructure, how the natural damage looked like. We're really playing with a feeling, and this is also why the editing principle is like it is. And I think it would easily fall apart if this connection with the text would be established. I think they just present a different aspect to the work, and you can get a lot more. They have a lot more informational value in a way because there is so much complexity to the topic. Like also, for example, we spoke with refugee rights activists, with climate lawyers, with sometimes simply with people who survived this situation. So there's a lot of these voices coming together, and you get a chance to understand them better.
I also didn't mean documentary. I think documentary is a very positive thing, but it's not. I guess it's what differentiates your work from being photojournalistic, right? That actually it's documentary, but at the same time very conceptual in the decision to not have this linear narrative that unfolds, but to maybe create more strength in the images by dissociating them from this narrative or from the details of the story that are surrounding the image, because it's also not like a necessary information, I guess, or it feels like that when I saw the exhibition.
No, I think like what the voices keep their autonomous, let's say, value is quite crucial, because it doesn't matter so much, is it who would say it? It is more about the feeling that you create in the space than actually connecting the dots because then this guy just becomes basically like, people anyway spend way more time with reading than with reading text than with reading images, and it is a capacity that many people have lost. And reading the narrative is something still rather important, and that is basically part of our ongoing project, but also bringing our own voices in it, because the reflective part through our own texts is rather important to also, get a deeper understanding to, how the situation, the shift of the perspective, how the situation looked from our side. I can't click further.
Yeah. No, I guess it's maybe also a good point to open up to the audience. Maybe someone of you has some questions or would like to comment on the exhibition you saw or on the practice of Anna and Jakob. We have a microphone we can share with you. Or, I mean, it's not like at school. Otherwise, I can also ask another
please
question.
ask.
Or I don't know. I don't know how we are time-wise, Fernanda. Maybe you say that. Finish. Better to finish.
Okay. Oh.
Okay. No, but
But
there's
I just have a short question about the importance, perhaps, of the locations. The other day on the opening, you said that you were trying to focus on the northern Mediterranean region, South Mediterranean region. Is it because it's the one most impacted by it? Is it, for instance, the food production of Spain? So, for instance, places that are very valuable to, I don't know, European existence, but at the same time in danger. And do you see perhaps this project expanding also in more inland, or perhaps at the northern region that's also sea-bound, or something like that?
Thanks for the question, Mate. No, definitely we're focused more on the Southern Europe because it is more affected, but actually also looking for situations which are not only environmental but also very politically interesting, or that there's a lot of political tensions involved. And for example, Italy was the first starting point because it actually has historic relations to ecofascism. And currently a neo-fascist government. So this was a big part of our interest. And as Jakob said earlier, being part of the climate movement automatically meant being against the government. So this was, there's always these second-hand stories that are triggering us to go to certain locations. The same was actually in Greece and in Spain. And I think one thing that they have in common, maybe Italy less, but the other places that we have been to, is that the climate crisis is really not a thing. So when you would speak to locals, to the farmers, you know, to people on the streets, what do they feel about it? They would have no clue what you're talking about. They know what kind of problems they have, for example, with water or with resources in general, but they would not really relate to the topic. So,
yeah, that is like, I mean, it's certainly not finished because like the longer plan is also to go on the other side of the Mediterranean, where Europe is right now outsourcing horrible migration laws. But that is maybe also where the two practices of the video works and the photographic works meet, is always looking for this point in which basically where does this polarization comes from and how does it develop. And I would say, like, in Europe you have of course like many of these stories, but the hypocrisy, how it is very often told, basically really leads to a deeper look or a less distanced look to it, a less objectifying look maybe also. Was that an equivalent answer?
Is there another question? No?
We are done.
I guess then we would just sum it up here, and you're of course invited to discuss with Anna and Jakob in an informal way afterwards. And thanks a lot for your attention and for being here. And